Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This week, I am talking with the writer, critic, editor, and curator Mimi Zeiger. Mimi has covered art, architecture, urbanism, and design for a wide variety of publications like the New York Times, Domus, Dwell, and the Architectural Review. In 1997, she founded Loud Paper, which was an independent zine and digital publication dedicated to increasing the volume of architecture discourse, and she is the co-creator of the US Pavilion for the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennalle. In this episode, Mimi and I talk about her early career working as an architect before discovering her true love of writing. We talk about the differences between writing and curating and the challenges with writing about design and architecture in our current sort of political moment. I've been reading Mimi's writing for years and was really excited to talk to her about all of these things. There's a lot in this one. I think you'll really like it. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter with additional content and episode previews. These memberships really help keep the podcast going. I just really appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Mimi Zeiger. I'd like to start kind of just with a little bit of your background and kind of how you got into all of this, because you originally studied architecture. You actually went to school for architecture, right?
Yeah, I went to Cornell for undergrad and I got a B.Arch.
Okay.
And then this was in the 94, I graduated. I moved back to the Bay Area and I was working in San Francisco in what was the kind of tail end of the downturn there. And I worked for a couple of architecture practices where I was doing much more corporate and retail type work and was getting a little disillusioned with practice. And then I sent out my grad school applications all over the place. And I wound up at Zeiger, which is a little bit of a strange place for me to land, having gone from Cornell and sort of the East Coast sort of training, the Texas Rangers, sort of covering that and sort of the move into decon to a place that was super experimental. At the time, it was on the West Side in a building that used to also be the Baywatch Studios. And so those kind of feelings of just openness and sort of playfulness, experimentation was all sort of in the building itself and in the park. It was basically open to the parking lot, and it seemed like a good place for me. I don't know why. It was actually, I think, a very visceral sort of decision to go there versus going to, say, like Columbia, because I had always wanted to go to New York and go to Columbia. But it seemed like a better decision at the time, and at that decision to go to Zeiger opened up sort of a world of sort of other ways of working for me.
I have a couple questions just kind of based on that. So I didn't realize that you had actually, your very early career, you worked as an architect or in an architecture studio. When you were thinking about grad school, was that, as you just said, you were it opened up these other ways of working. Is that something you were hoping to get out of grad school, or was that kind of this accident? What was kind of your mindset at that time?
When I went back to grad school, I kept telling friends, I'm going to go to Zeiger and I'm going to learn how to weld and I'm going to get into design build. Like, I wanted a much more immediate way of practicing. I had been working at a company that was doing a lot of like retail interiors. I couldn't tell you how many like pottery barns I designed over the couple of years that I was there. And so I wanted something that was much more tactile, much more immediate. And I thought design build might be a way into that. Turns out I'm not a welding kind of person. Like, what is it, like measure twice, cut once? Like, I can't even like measure like once. Like I'm lousy at shop. I am scared of the bandsaw. And so when I got to Zeiger, I needed to figure out sort of what my MO was there. This was, yeah, and I was sort of excited to sort of in the same way that you were describing your own sort of trajectory about all of the stuff that is around architecture, right? The kind of the curatorial, the writing, sort of pop culture. This was 96, 97. I was in grad school. The internet was still fairly new. I was sort of immersed in sort of music scene and also zines. And so I began to look at sort of pop culture and sort of alternative punk culture as maybe an expression for architecture, to maybe draw from that to open up sort of new ways of practicing and new ways of writing and, sort of new voices.
Oh, this is, I mean, yeah, I'm actually kind of surprised how similar your kind of experience was to my own. And this, I want to talk about Loud Paper, which I guess started as a project in grad school, right?
It was my graduate thesis in the same way that your podcast is your thesis, and that it couldn't finish. Like I did 3 editions while in grad school, and then continued to do like another 10 over the years afterwards.
So before we talk about that, I have one other question, and I don't mean to. I hope this doesn't sound like I'm kind of limiting or kind of defining your work, but when I know your work primarily as a writer, and I've thought of you for a long time as a writer. And we'll talk about kind of the other things you do in a bit. But how'd you start writing, or how did kind of all of these things you were doing, writing, bubble up as a thing that you were good at, or that could actually be a career?
I'm not sure I ever thought I was good at it. I'm still sometimes not sure that I'm particularly good at it.
Interesting.
Maybe that's what drives everybody, right?
Yeah.
It took me a long time to self-identify as a writer and not an architect. And then it also took me a long time to identify as a critic, not just a writer. And so these have been sort of evolutions over my career. So now I consider myself a critic and a curator. But 5-10 years ago, I considered myself, sort of a design journalist. And 10 years before that, I was an architect who wrote. This
sounds so familiar now.
So it was a struggle. And I think what sort of moved me along was I'll always have that architectural training, and I think it actually gives me a point of view distinct from some of my colleagues in the sense that I really know how to translate from sort of the archi-speak into real world. Like I have a patience for it that I think some people don't. But really, as I moved the idea of thinking about myself, it really was based on sort of how I went through my day. Like I began thinking about sort of the techniques of writing and the techniques of shaping stories and sort of researching projects. And that was really what was driving me, not necessarily sort of the big architectural questions. I mean, those are latent, but so sort of that I think just moved me towards sort of considering myself a journalist, and then moving towards critic. Actually, I think I'm more closely connected to my early self and the kind of architectural pursuit of what architecture can do and how architecture is positioned in the world than maybe that middle period.
Can you talk a little bit more? This is something that's endlessly fascinating to me, and I've talked to a couple people about this also, but could you talk a little bit more about that kind of those differences between being a writer versus being a journalist versus being a critic, whether that's kind of a process question or an approach question or an output question. The fact that you kind of had to evolve or had to, there was a struggle maybe to identify as each of those. I would love to just kind of hear about those differences and why they're maybe even different kind of in your career.
I can do my best.
Okay. That's all I'm asking.
I mean, I think overarching, I'm a writer. I'm interested in the acts of writing, of wordcraft, of research. And I think what maybe the distinction between journalist and critic, I would probably always be a journalist. I take on stories that are research based, and that's, I'll do interviews, I'll go out and cite work, I'll run down sources and report. But I think being a critic adds this other layer that I think has to be earned, and maybe earned over time, which is that I can see things within contexts now. That maybe really early, like loud paper kind of voice of like critical architecture voice, really snarky, really kind of slash and burn, like know it all. And then you went through a whole period of not knowing, right? Of having to unlearn sort of those assumptions. Now I've sort of gained back a certain amount of expertise, and I can see how work sort of sits within sort of a larger context of history, a larger context of politics. And those are the kinds of things that I often hold architecture to, or design to, is these sort of bigger questions. I'm not out to do a full takedown of anything. Those are, often fun to read, but actually kind of lazy to write. And, what I want to do is sort of think about sort of what are the deeper meanings and sort of what we're looking at, what kind of, or an exhibition or a book that we're sort of wrangling with, and really sort of take it on and ask ourselves, what does this mean now? Like, what is that kind of meta thing? It's sort of funny. I have a couple influences, I think, that sort of were along the way. And those include folks like Joan Didion and Dave Hickey, which I think really were influential in voice. But also like someone like Ira Glass and This American Life. And, he talks about how he does the radio program, and that a story always has that moment of reflection, of that kind of that meta moment. Yeah. And I think sort of being a critic is about sort of taking on that meta, like, okay, here this is, and then like, okay, like let's take that sort of like third act pause and sort of reposition sort of the things that we're seeing against something else or within something else.
Right. That's really interesting. I want to hopefully connect this a little bit to loud paper, and then use loud paper to kind of talk about your career since, because I will admit that I have not seen kind of the original versions of loud paper. I was only aware of it as the blog kind of format that it became, but something that always interested me about that project, and I think about your work in general, and you started to say it in kind of what you were just answering, is that you were very interested in the story aspect, or in connecting it to larger ideas. And so in loud paper, especially, there was a very clear kind of point of view. There's a very clear kind of voice to each piece. But then you were connecting it to things like pop culture and things outside of architecture. Where did that, I mean, I don't mean to be so reductive, but where'd that kind of come from, or that idea that you could be writing about this very specific topic within this larger world?
If we go sort of to the beginnings of loud paper, and we sort of set it in, it's late 90s. I'm living sort of in Santa Monica, like sort of think of LA. Late 90s, going to SciArc, maybe the city itself and sort of the things that I was interested in within LA, sort of music and, sort of riding my bike down, sort of the Venice Boardwalk, or not even Venice Boardwalk, but down like Lincoln Avenue, or Lincoln Boulevard, which was at the time like this really kind of like long boulevard that connected SciArc to my house, and was like lots of sort of blank stores and weird sort of things going on. And I think that the kind of the built environment itself was lending those connections, right? So or if you're driving it and you've got like KXLU on the radio station, and so you've got like sort of like, I don't know, who was I listening to at the time? Like someone like the Eiler set,
Okay,
or like Sebastian, or Superchunk, or, like whoever was like in my ears, and you've got that as your soundtrack. And then you're sort of looking out in the world. It's not so far from like Rainer Banham, right? Who is also making similar connections between sort of the kind of the built environment and sort of the stuff of culture, however kind of junky or fragmented that might be.
And did you want to see, I don't mean to, I hope I'm not kind of projecting this onto you kind of in retrospect, but was part of the kind of initiative or the drive for that project to basically be able to read more writing like that? Like, were you kind of trying to put out what you wanted more of? You know what I mean?
I think yes. I mean, the subtitle of Loud Paper is increasing the volume of architectural discourse.
Yeah.
Like it was meant to sort of play both ways, right? It was both louder, because I had felt that architectural writing was really kind of quiet. It was the pre-blog explosion that you were talking about early on, pre like things like wallpaper or dwell, like sort of like the kind of mass mainstream consumption of architecture and design hadn't hit, and so architecture itself was really a much more either academic or very trade oriented thing, and I wanted architecture that looked like the kinds of things I was reading. It was like I wanted architecture that was like Chick Factor, So I think in that sense, I wanted more places for me to write, and I wanted more places for my friends and like-minded thinkers to write.
Yeah. So you finish grad school and you have this kind of zine that you've put together. What was the plan? Were you kind of fully in, I am a writer now, or kind of what came after that?
There were some rocky years after that.
Yeah, of course.
I had went back up to the Bay Area. I was working briefly for an architecture firm, doing kind of more horrible, like, sort of stuff. I remember spending a day hand shading sort of a Mediterranean style, like, strip mall. Like, like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
And I luckily was able to transition to teach part-time, and then part-time continue to do Loud Paper. And it was through Loud Paper that this is probably around 2000 that the folks from the magazine that would become Dwell got in contact with me. And Carrie Jacobs, who was the original editor-in-chief of Dwell, I remember getting on the phone with her and her offering me a job to be an editor at Dwell, and she still teases me because she says, I can't believe that you turned down being an editor at Dwell to continue to work on your zine. But that's what I did. I don't regret it because I became a frequent contributor to Dwell at that time, and Carrie was actually an incredible mentor for being able to sort of give me a platform to sort of really learn the skills of journalism and making stories.
Yeah.
That weren't just sort of snarky zine stories.
Right.
And it's from there that I began to sort of build sort of a larger freelance career.
And so it was like literally this kind of thing that happened over time, even kind of immediately post grad school. You weren't even thinking of yourself as a writer, even though you were publishing writing. Yeah,
I think I was still thinking of myself as an architect who wrote, or someone who writes about architecture. Like it wasn't the clarity of that identity really did take quite a while to sort of crystallize.
And it's, you mentioned earlier about that all of this was before the kind of wave of popular design and architecture writing and this kind of explosion of this culture. how did that, I have two questions around that. How did that change kind of your job or kind of how you were writing or what it meant to be a writer when this subject that you were writing about that there wasn't a lot of people caring about it and it was a kind of insular thing suddenly became popular?
I think it was really exciting. I mean, I think what drives a lot of us, and you were making reference to it when we first got on the phone or on the Skype, is fandom.
Yeah.
Like that there is an enthusiasm and like you just, you want to be in the mix. It's not like, I've rarely been a person who wants to be like I'm ambitious, but I'm not like, I want to be like that top person.
Right.
Like I want to be in the discourse. Like
Right.
that is sort of like, I want to be in the mix, one of the voices, like in conversation. And that's what's really important to me. So to sort of watch it explode and expand, and for my own education to sort of see where different outlets are and begin to write about them, that was what was really exciting, was sort of being able to get access into this conversation and watch the conversation take shape, and then even track with people who have continued to be sort of friends and collaborators. I think about someone like Sam Jacob, formerly of Fat, and when Fat was like a brand new studio, he contributed some stuff for Loud Paper. We were in conversation. Like the zine itself began to find people like me. And it was really kind of exhilarating as we began, people all over the world and internet culture, like allowing us to connect, to find these sort of like-minded folks and know that they were out there and sometimes collaborate and sort of build an alternative scene to what was there before.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. This is something that I've thought about a lot and actually doesn't come up in these conversations as much as it should. As I was mentioning before we started recording, that, my kind of first introduction to design was as this suburban kid who suddenly kind of found these design blogs, and part of it was this thing that I had always liked suddenly had a name, but the other side of it was that suddenly I saw that there were other people that liked this thing too, which was a new thing for me. And I think the way you said it, I thought was perfect, of just wanting to kind of be in the discourse or kind of be in this community. I think it's just an important part of this that I don't think I talk about enough. So I love that you kind of brought that up. Did it also, on the kind of flip side of that, did it also open up the subject matter? I mean, you didn't just stay writing about architecture in the traditional sense, and it's become much more about, I don't mean to put these kind of definitions around it, but design in the widest sense, where you have kind of written about all of these tangentially related things. How did was that kind of happening through all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's driven by curiosity. It's driven by sometimes editors who think of me for a story, and then they're like, hey, do you want to take on, I'm trying to think of a good example, and of course I'm drawing a blank, but, but recently for Landscape Architecture magazine, I pitched them a story about the legalization of pot and what that was going to do to the California landscape.
Oh, interesting.
And that became like one of my favorite stories to work on. I think I did that last year because it just sort of like the people I got to talk to, how they were sort of approaching it. Like these weren't designers; these are like sort of like entrepreneurs and law enforcement officials. And like suddenly, like I'm the design filter. I'm sort of looking at it through like, okay, this is like landscape, and what does this mean? But I get to sort of like parse all of these other points of view. Plus, everyone was so nice and
yeah.
If you ever want to meet the nicest people in the world are like growers.
Right. That raises another question that I'm always curious about, and it's kind of about the role the role or the position of the critic or of the writer. And we kind of talked about this earlier when you were talking about the profession or about kind of the audience for this type of writing opening up. And something I think about in graphic design, especially, is so much of graphic design writing is written for other designers. And architecture, I think, as an outsider who has never been in the architecture world, it seems like architecture has done a good job, or architecture writers or critics have done a good job of being able to write for people who are not in architecture. And so the question that I guess I'm trying to get at is kind of, who do you think of as your audience, or how do you write or is this something you even think about, writing for something that can appeal to those inside but also be relevant and interesting and educational for people outside?
Yeah, no, I don't think there's a single audience.
Okay.
And I think one of the things that is part of the role of the critic or the role of the writer is to be able to modulate your voice, not lose your voice, but actually modulate it based on sort of what the platform is. So if I'm writing, say, on zine, an opinion piece, like that can be a way more wonky. Like it can be a little bit more inside baseball, right? Because I know that this is a pretty like hardcore architecture audience and architecture design audience. And I can make sort of like global we statements and sort of understand that these are the folks who are on board with me. But then in other outlets, I need to take on a much more sort of more a little more passive sort of point of view, or a little, maybe sort of take it back a level, sort of make it a little bit more inclusive. Inclusive might be the way to put it. So if that is a kind of a more broad trade magazine or sort of a shelter title or a newspaper or something.
And does that kind of come out based on, like, is that something you're conscious of kind of at the beginning when you're writing? Is that something that kind of comes out through editing? Or, like, how do you kind of modulate between those differences? Or is it literally a kind of essay by essay basis?
It can be a real essay by essay basis. A lot of times it's, rule number one when writing for an outlet is to know the voice of that outlet.
Yeah.
So I'll read other stories. In other places, I've just have long-term relationships, so I sort of automatically know how much voice I can bring to the table. And sometimes it's really a relationship with an editor. I think when we talk about often in writing, the editor and the editorial process gets dropped out. I've served as an editor many times over the years, and so that relationship, having a good editor, sometimes a pretty like strong editor, can also sort of change what you're, how you're looking at something and how you're sort of writing about it.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about curating also. And you were a co-curator for the US Pavilion for this year's Venice Biennalle, and I'm going to ask. I have a couple questions around that, but I'm going to ask a very probably oversimplified question to start. But what's the difference between being a critic and being a curator, or did that change how you had to think about the work, kind of when you're moving from text to space and objects and all this other stuff?
I think one of the things that's been part of my practice and slowly sort of integrated into my practice probably over the last 10 years it is curation. I think it grows more out of my editorial practice and my sort of enjoyment of bringing people together. So if that's like through curating programming, and then that sort of becomes curating exhibitions, and sort of smaller exhibitions and then larger ones. So it's, without talking about relational aesthetics, I want it, maybe it's relational, right? Like as an editor, you see, you see works in sort of a whole, say, issue of Loud Paper, or an issue of the LA Forum newsletter, or an issue of the Architect's newspaper, all think places that I've edited, Architecture magazine I edited. You see all of these pieces sort of together, and sort of how they're going to sing as a whole, and who are all the different sort of players and stakeholders in that. And then I think curation is not dissimilar from that, right? That you're bringing together various people's work, and then you begin to nurture that work based on sort of a structure and idea, concept, and then it sort of manifests in the galleries, and then a whole secondary set of readings opens up, and that's the exciting part, and that's always the exciting part in making publications too, right? Is that you bring these things together. And then there's sort of the through lines when someone says something in one piece and then it echoes in another one. So in the galleries at the US Pavilion, something is said in the first gallery and then that's echoed in the last gallery. And I have a little bit of a geek out because we have rocks in the first gallery that are taken from Memphis, and then we have an asteroid in the last gallery that has sort of come to Earth, It happens in both of these, sort of as a material question of stone, and and I get a little bit of oh my God, that totally worked.
The theme this year was dimensions of citizenship, and I have a question that might be this is a weird question, but about 2 years ago, I think it was either right before or right after the election, you wrote a piece, I think it was for zine, that was it was about a lot of things, but it was kind of asking about architecture and design's role kind of in response to crisis, or in response to kind of the world at the moment. And it was a great piece. I loved that essay. And as I was thinking about our conversation, I was wondering if Dimensions of Citizenship is somewhat of a response or an answer to the questions you are asking in that piece, where you are kind of looking at architecture in the built environment in regards to kind of our political situation and what it means to be a citizen and to be inside and outside and walls and bridges and kind of all the stuff you were asking about 2 years ago seems like this is kind of an answer. And I'm curious if you think that interpretation could be right, or if that's something you've thought about.
That's a really perceptive sort of connection there, because that piece that I wrote around architecture in crisis, and then another piece that I wrote a little time right after the election. I think the architecture in crisis, I think I wrote during the sort of the Black Lives Matter, sort of the summer of sort of police shootings and things. And then right after the election, I wrote this piece around sort of architecture and speculation.
Oh, right.
And what and I think both of those pieces are, frankly, I had a responsibility to those pieces that maybe I needed to try to answer those questions through this exhibit, and that's a lot of a task to put on a participant, one of our exhibitors, but I think there was in both of those pieces something that I wanted to make sure that we got out of. We may not have a full answer to it, and I think we have directions in the pavilion, but I think those were definitely resonating with me, and I'm kind of excited that you picked up on that, because they definitely felt like I was like, oh man, as a critic, I've put this stuff out there, and now as a curator, I have to kind of own up to these things that I have asked for.
Yeah. And what was that process like, or kind of how did you even, with your kind of collaborators and the people that you invited to participate, how did you kind of start to think about kind of responding to that theme, or to really look critically at design's role basically in our kind of current situation? How do you start to kind of articulate that in that process?
Well, it was an extremely collaborative process. So my co-curators, Neil Atkinson and Louis and Iker Gill, like we were in a room together, basically brainstorming these ideas. This was probably, I want to say maybe this was like last August.
Okay.
Just a little over a year ago. We were sitting in a room. We had already been told that we had the proposal that had been accepted.
Okay.
And we really needed to sort of figure out like what our tone, what our direction was. And, we just were having these incredible conversations where we all brought different things to the table. So Neil is a historian with a interest in sort of Venice and Florence, sort of Italian Renaissance and the questions of sound. I'm a critic. I'm bringing like these big, hey, what does architecture can do? Both Iker and Anne are architects, but they also are deeply involved in sort of different ways of practice. Mm-hmm. And so we all like brought all of this, sort of stuff to the table and began the story we love to tell is that we ended up creating an artist brief out of that was something we called turn-ons and turn-offs. It was a list, and It was very much inspired by Fluxus and Fluxus lists. The idea that a list is more than just sort of a list of words, but that there's cross connections between them. Uh-huh. And we didn't want it to be do's and don'ts. We also were quite inspired by sort of ideas of 68 and sort of into the 70s, sort of the Whole Earth Catalog, Bucky Fuller, Do It, all of these things were sort of in our sort of cultural memory. And so this list began on one side and turn-ons with Afrofuturism.
Oh, okay.
And it ended that list, the turn-ons with resistance, and then the turn-offs, I can't quite remember what it began with, but it ended with utopia. Oh. And, I think we were really trying to set kind of parameters or a brief that would give our participants a lot of meat to work with. So I think there were things on turn-offs there was turn-ons was like jokes, and turn-offs was like inside jokes.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So we wanted to have, even though we had this really serious conversation about what does it mean, to make architecture and sort of have in the sort of around citizenship right now. Mm-hmm. We also wanted to see if we could bring some humor, some lightness, some playfulness to this concept, because this is how we live now. This we are in, we are in a kind of a bad joke, and we need to figure out how we operate within it.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. The reason I ask kind of such specific questions around kind of the process or the thinking is because as I was thinking about it, preparing for this to talk to you about it, I was thinking about how this podcast started kind of mid 2016, but I launched, the first episode came out October 2016, like a month before the election. And it was this kind of, I was talking to these people about the importance of design criticism, and then the election happened, and suddenly it was like, man, this seems so superficial to be talking about design criticism right now. Like, is this actually a worthy subject? And the more I thought about it, I think, and similar to kind of what you were just talking about, is that design plays such an important role in all of these things in various ways, whether it's things like literally the built environment down to things like filter bubbles and fake news and things like that are all kind of design problems. And so I've just been thinking about how much the criticism that the design criticism that I want to see more of, the design criticism that I want to write more of, I'm very much a product of my time, and that's kind of where my interest is right now. And it sounds like I'm the question I'm trying to get to is, has that kind of changed your approach to writing about these things?
Um, how do I say this? Um, the number of fucks one gives
Yeah.
has decreased greatly.
Yeah.
Sort of coming down to like a little bit of a zero fuck policy.
Right.
Pardon my French. You know, it's hard. It's hard to write about lightweight things
Right.
in essentially a time of crisis. However, like you can also bring the seriousness
We're, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
of where we are now to sort of things that are maybe more frivolous, and continue to sort of wrangle with and analyze. Sort of what does it mean? Like I interviewed Willow Perone,
I
who
don't know that name.
basically Willow is the basically creative director mastermind who works basically behind Yeezy and
Oh.
Kanye
Oh.
with
Okay.
Kanye. And I
Oh.
interviewed
Right.
him.
I read that. I read that piece.
Yeah,
You wrote that. Yeah.
and I wrote that piece kind of in the middle of the biggest crunch to get the work for Dimensions of Citizenship out.
Oh. Okay.
And at the time, like my head was full of a lot of like Fred Morton and undercommons and
Mm.
questions of like what does black space mean, and like sort of how do we move through it, and sort of who has rights and access of citizenship. And then I go and I like go to Calabasas and
Right.
sort of at the time I was like there was a potential to talk to Kanye.
Oh. Wow.
It didn't materialize, but I think the idea that potentially I could ask him about black space
Yeah.
was really at the back of my mind. Um,
Huh.
but Willow brought to the table questions of ecology, questions of belonging, that we may not have gotten to if my head had only been in like fashion and like
Right.
celebrity. Like this was
Right.
like we ended up talking for not a lot of it made it into the piece because it was a fairly short piece, but like we ended up talking for like quite a bit about sort of like what remains, like what lasts,
Yeah.
and that in a way the work that he's doing with Kanye is about like things that are sort of brutal enough to sort of withstand the end of the world, and
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
a city that's now flooded and water bottles are floating all over, like a
Right.
little bit if maybe a little bit like lemonade-y,
Yeah.
to mix my celebrity
Right.
performers.
It works. I get it.
But then we're in this like, okay, like this is something we can get to,
Yeah.
and it's just as meaningful, that we were able to get there as it is that so whatever the new sort of headquarters that they have out in Calabasas
Yeah.
is all about,
What?
which is quite beautiful, but such a strange place.
Yeah. I mean, the images in that piece were just. I loved them, but it did not seem like a very creative place. Actually, it seemed very cold and sterile.
And when I was there, it was, those photos were completely contrived or were taken very early,
Oh.
because when I was there, it was full of stuff,
Oh.
like
Okay.
endless amounts of
Okay.
samples and reference materials and books and people, and which is kind of too bad. It'd be great to photograph it, but like
Yeah.
kind of as a mess, and
Yeah.
because I think it maybe tells more about the kind of creative influences going on at Easy. But yeah, it's
Yeah. That's interesting. What else are you thinking about right now, or what as a critic and writer and just kind of general thinker, what are the other issues or topics that have been on your mind lately, either that you're currently writing about or want to write about or just kind of thinking about?
I think one of the questions that I keep coming back to, and I've sort of been working on this for a couple of years now, is the idea of slowness. and actually and this is responsive to the kind of barrage of the news cycle that I'm often feeling. Sometimes the responsibility of a critic is to respond quickly. So like something happens and you make a piece about it. And I've been kind of resisting that way of working of late, and trying to build a little bit of latency into the process, so that that I'm slow. So basically, it means I'm slow.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
Something will happen in the news, and I'll respond to it. A week, maybe 2 weeks later, bringing in yet another reference that might begin to tie things together. But I'm not responding with a one hit in the moment. I'm maybe responding with a more complicated, maybe complex condition a little bit later. And that's been a way of practicing that I have been trying to get to, and trying to coalesce. So that's something I've been thinking about. And related to that, with a group of friends that I've been collaborating with for quite a long time, with my friends Enrique Ramirez, who's a historian and a design writer, Michael Kubo, another historian, architect, writer, and Chris Grimley, an architect and curator who runs Pink Comma Gallery. The four of us have had an ongoing conversation about lateness.
Oh, interesting.
So, and this is related to slow, but it's also kind of a generational condition of, okay, we grew up with late modernism, we grew up with late capital.
That's
we're
so interesting.
A little bit behind the beat as a generation, because we're all relatively Gen X. How do we begin to start a conversation about late? And that's something that we're actively working on right now. It is combining, so the economic, the aesthetic, and maybe this cultural drag. So that, again, we're not responding in the heat of it. And this is maybe because we have historians on board in this conversation, right? That maybe I'm an aspiring historian. I don't think I'll ever go back and do a PhD, but yeah, I think I'm surrounded by them, and so we tend to think of things in the long view, right? As the Obama view, right?
Right. That idea of slowness, I think, is actually really really interesting, and I'm thinking about it. That immediately reminds me of Rebecca Solnit, who I feel like is a master at that, especially now, where there'll be something in the news and everybody writes their think piece, and then like 2 weeks later she'll have something on LitHub or wherever she's writing that just connects a bunch of these things. And every time I'm like, why do I read anyone else? Like, why don't I just wait for her opinion on this? And you had mentioned, this is my last question, you had mentioned some people earlier that have kind of inspired you or kind of shaped how you think about writing, or people you consider good writers. But I always like to end the podcast with kind of a reading list or a book list. Are there essays, books, writers, critics who have kind of influenced you, or that you find yourself coming back to again and again, that you'd want to share?
Sure. Solnit is an incredible example, and sometimes I don't feel like I'd be able to get through these times without her.
Yeah, same.
So definitely being able to set the tone for being able to have a clear perspective to keep up the resistance, and keep up hope. Other things that I've been reading, and I think I mentioned Dave Hickey and air guitar as someone who I've always come back to, for a punch of how do you really make your statement, right? How do you just kind of get it out there? I was recently rereading Sorkin for a piece that I did for the Architectural Review, and his sort of statement of, all architecture is political.
Right.
And so, I come back to sort of collections of criticism from time to time. Rayner Banham, but
Right.
often Esther McCoy is often my go-to for like anything on LA. As I look to see what she said.
Yeah. I don't know her as well.
Often more times, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know her as well as the others. She's someone I need to catch up on, I feel like.
Yeah, there's an incredible volume of her work called Piecing It Together that came out a few years ago, and highly recommend that book. It sometimes it's almost like an I Ching.
Okay, nice.
You can just drop in and be like, what does Esther have to say now?
I love that.
And let me think. I'm always reading stuff. I just finished Rachel Kushner's The Mars Room.
Oh, I've heard good things about that.
It's kind of devastating and amazing, and in a way that tone that this is maybe overstepping a little bit, because I don't think we achieved it in the same sort of way that she did. But the way to have some humor, humanism, and sort of seriousness in something that we were striving for the pavilion, I think she is able to really create a very nuanced view of sort of the justice system that is like powerful as anything.
Yeah, it's been on my list for a while. I gotta pick that one up.
And I also, her Flamethrowers is brilliant.
Oh yeah,
so I highly recommend that one.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I'm a big fan. I kind of love your work and how you, and talking to you, just how you think about these things, and just found this such an interesting conversation. So thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
This episode was recorded on June 29th, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.